seriously on repentance and repair. I feel like one of those Netflix series, but there's no button that says skip recap, because I'm going to give it to you anyway. So we've been talking about the 5-part process, as you will recall, beginning with confessing your sin, right? And that's number 1. And number 2, which is up on the screen there, is starting to think differently and starting to change your mind about things. And the 3rd part of this process is to actually make amends. So what can you do differently moving forward? And the 4th part, which is the one that we just talked about 2 weeks ago, is what would a sincere apology look like? And today we're going to wrap it up by talking about what would a different way forward look like? What would making a different choice look like moving forward as a habit and not just as a one-off kind of thing? And in order to do that, I'm going to finally mention an F word that I haven't mentioned before. Are you ready for it? It's the word forgiveness, right? Notice I haven't talked much about forgiveness. And so I wanted to bring that up in terms of what would forgiveness look like if harm was done to you. Now, what I want to mention is that there is no requirement out there that one actually forgives immediately, especially, and I want to highlight this, if the person that you're asking for forgiveness from comes from a historically marginalized community or holds a historically marginalized identity. Now, the example that Rabbi Rutenberg uses comes from the Civil War, when there was a rush, especially from the Yankees, mind you, to have reconciliation and unity with white Southerners. Here's what she said about it. She said, the families of, and she ties that back into today and why we as a society haven't really talked about the other implications of quote unquote reconciliation and unity without taking into consideration Black folks and their civil rights and safety. And again, she ties it into the police brutality that we're experiencing today. She says, the families of those killed by police are asked to grant forgiveness to someone who has not asked for it, but are really being asked to absolve the system. The system meaning the institution of the police and maybe the state as a whole that produced the individual shooter. The request for forgiveness is functionally a request to not name an injustice as an injustice. It is a request that the families of victims not demand amends, recourse, or the kind of systemic change that might prevent the same kind of harm in the future. Meaning that this rush for forgiveness is a way to bypass some of the more painful, perhaps, and uncomfortable aspects of coming back into right relationship. And note that she says also that when the victims are primarily white, the question simply does not come up. And we noticed this recently with, remember the shooting at Mother Emanuel AME in Charlottesville, Virginia that took place? Remember how in the courtroom, there was a rush by the media to go after the victims and say, do you forgive the shooter, Dylan Roof, the white supremacist shooter that went in and opened fire at that church? And for me, the question was a bit premature because not a lot of work has happened yet at that time to address the harm that was done. And so again, I feel like forgiveness is sometimes optional, that it's not a guarantee that the one that you've done harm to automatically forgives you for what you've done. And at the same time, one has to ask the question of if one chooses not to forgive or at least not to forgive yet, at what cost would that burden be of not forgiving as well? And the image that comes to my mind is, how many of you have seen the documentary back in the year 2000, The Eyes of Tammy Faye? Or it was remade a couple of years ago with Jessica Chastain of the same name. Only one or two of you. Well, it wasn't in the remake, but in the original one, Tammy Faye Baker Messner actually preached at a church in Palm Springs where she talks about how in the olden days, if you killed someone, you are required to carry their dead bodies on your back. And instead of going to prison, for example, right? And doing so ends up killing you, right? Because you have to carry that burden and that load on your back forever and ever. You have to think about the harm that you've done in killing that person that's now on your back. And so what these two movies highlight, actually, is the fact that the evangelical world and even the televangelists are not all that unified. Because Tammy Faye had a conflict with Jerry Falwell, of all people, right? And these two movies actually gave me a much more sympathetic perspective about Tammy Faye. And so she said, instead of carrying Jerry Falwell on my back, I chose to let him go. That way, I could move on with my life, and this is why I'm practicing forgiveness. So it wasn't necessarily for Jerry Falwell, but that act of forgiveness was more for her own sense of relief moving forward. So that's one way of looking at it. And then some of you might be asking, well, what if the perpetrator of the crime or the harm that was done to me is already dead? In which case, might I suggest investing in a medium? But in all seriousness, if that's not possible, then again, might I suggest therapy? Whatever it is that would bring you a sense of closure for yourself, and whatever work that you perhaps need to do to engage in this forgiveness process can be done even if someone is no longer present physically, in order for you to have that conversation with around what reconciliation and reparation would look like. So that's the first angle of this. The second angle is, what if you're the one that committed the crime or committed the harm or the violence against another human being? What then? Well, again, perhaps take another look at this five-part process that Rabbi Rotenberg suggests. And I must say that ask for forgiveness has to come from a sincere and authentic and vulnerable place. Otherwise, that asking for forgiveness is just going to end up being toxic, right? And that relationship will not move forward in a healthy kind of way. And the last piece of this forgiveness angle is a piece that I only learned about quite recently. And remember when I preached a few weeks ago about the fact that I have not tried to numb myself by drinking alcohol or doing any kind of illicit drugs? Remember that conversation? Well, there is an asterisk and a fine print to that. Because a couple of years ago, during my sabbatical, I decided to go through a detoxification process and a reset for my life by going to the Amazon jungle for an ayahuasca experience. Now, there's been a lot of research lately about plant-based medicine and its benefits towards our psyche and towards cleansing our emotions and our spiritual lives, I'd like to call it. And so I wanted to have this reset moment after my divorce to put an end to that chapter and to figure out what my new chapter will look like. So in this setting, as many of you probably know, it's an uncomfortable setting because that plant-based medicine doesn't taste too good, all right? And a lot of people, in fact, vomit as a result, and they encourage you to vomit because that purging process actually is what gets rid of the toxins that you've been carrying around. And of course, I couldn't do it because I was too afraid that I might be judged by the people sitting next to me. Even though, as you can imagine, they're all throwing up. They could care less whether I was throwing up or not, right? And during that third session, I actually started having not only visions, but my body reacted to it. And it was in the form of I started dancing uncontrollably. And the reason I knew that it wasn't necessarily coming from me, but is because I know I don't possess those kind of moves, right? We're talking like deep shoulder actions here, you know? I mean, again, I can't even replicate it when I'm sober at this point. So when that happened, I also experienced a vision of my ancestors surrounding me, like a cloud of witnesses. And I began thinking, oh dear, here we go. This is gonna be like Dancing with the Stars. They're gonna hold up scorecards, you know, judging me and giving me a number here, right? But none of that happened. And so I thought, wow, so there really is no judgment coming from them. So where's this judgment coming from? Why does my body still feel so uncomfortable? Why can't I throw up? Why can't I find any relief? And so I started to go through this litany of forgiveness. I started forgiving my ancestors for whatever hurt or damage they might have caused that had this ancestral trauma present in my body at this point. I forgave them. I started to feel a little sense of relief after that. Then I started forgiving my parents. Because as we all know, everything that's wrong with us, we could blame on our parents, right? So I started forgiving them. And then I even started forgiving my ex, which was one of the most difficult forgiveness process I had to go through. And it took me a good 2 or 3 years to even get there. But still, no relief until, guess who the hardest person was to forgive in this whole process? That's right, me, right? Because I'm the only one judging myself for making a fool out of myself by dancing uncontrollably in front of this group of strangers, right? And I'm the only one who couldn't forgive myself for my past and whatever it was that I did or didn't do or the mistakes I made. All of that came to this point of, can I forgive myself or not? Then I started thinking about this great quote by Oprah, who said, forgiveness is letting go of any hope that the past can be any different. What a powerful definition of forgiveness, right? That I can't undo the past. I can only move forward with my actions now, with my choices, right this very minute moving forward. And so I started thinking about this whole concept too of grace and how at that moment I gave myself grace because forgiveness was a gift to me and it was a gift to others. So it was a 360-degree of showing grace, which is unmerited favor to everyone around me. And at that point was when I began to feel this sense of atonement in my life. Now, some of you may be wondering, especially those of you who were raised in a Catholic tradition perhaps, or even in a Jewish tradition where atonement has to do with a sacrificial lamb, right? Where you place all the sins of the community on, and you either let that lamb go to a different town or you kill that lamb. And in Christian theology, especially in the 11th century, that became in the form of sacrificial atonement and this whole idea that Jesus was that sacrificial lamb who died for your sins, so on and so forth. So atonement kind of has a bloody past and a bloody theology behind it. But the kind of atonement I want to think about today is the kind that Rabbi Ruttenberg mentions, which is if we break down this word atonement, it's really at one meant, right? What are we at one with? What are we coming back into relationship with? How can we find that hidden wholeness within us through this act of mercy and grace and forgiveness and reconciliation? So that's what I want to explore further in my life. And in order to do so, again, I want to just close with this quote by Desmond Tutu, who says that we are not responsible for what breaks us. However, we can be responsible for what puts us back together. So this whole process that we've been talking about, this whole series that we've been engaged in, is about that question of how can we put the pieces back together? How can we come back into right relationship with one another? How can we come back to being in right relationship with ourselves? To summarize the 5-part series, it boils down to, for me, A, think differently, with apologies to Apple for stealing their tagline, right? Think differently, act differently, and choose differently. Our choices moving forward do matter. And I hope that this whole process becomes a realignment, because they say that it takes 21 days to build a habit. So it's not going to be instantaneous, this whole process of forgiveness. It's not going to take hours or even days in order for us to get to this point. Again, it took me years to even get to the point of starting to forgive myself. So I encourage all of us to give ourselves some grace, some patience, and some compassion as we think differently, act differently, and choose differently moving forward. Maybe so.
Hi, and welcome to Getting the Message, where we dive a little bit deeper into today's service themes. Reverend Jonipher, good as always to sit down with you.
Likewise, Amber. Thanks for having me.
So today is about a different way forward. Yes?
It is indeed, because we've been talking for the past few weeks about the 4 other parts of this process, and we started thinking about what a different way forward might look like. But today, we're actually making it into a habit. And as we know, habits take a while to form. They say, 21 days or something like that, right? So this is definitely not an instantaneous kind of process, because doing something different requires practice, and it requires perseverance, and it requires perhaps, well, not perhaps, but it does require a lot of self-reflection. Yeah, modeling new behavior. But before we go there, can I ask you a question for a change, Amber?
Yeah, sure.
How's it been going with your workshop, your common read experience so far with members of the congregation?
Yeah, no, I've really loved this experience this year. So I love how first that we did turn it into this sermon series, and like that we had my message as well to like kind of kick everything off. Right. But we've had a good amount of signups. You can still sign up. We have 2 more sessions left, and there's books if you're interested. So please feel free to sign up. We've had a really good turnout for things, and so far our first session was really heavy on just kind of like the general principles, unpacking what we were experiencing from the book, how like it resonates with us, how it resonates with our experience in life, and a lot of that. And it was really great, some great conversation. We talked about right relations, and I shared with them like one of the UU pages about right relations and like some of the questions that you can ask to consider if you're in right relations with another person. And there's a lot of really great reflection going on. And then our upcoming session is about how we do it in covenanted communities. So we're going to actually, I grabbed a covenant from another UU congregation so that we can kind of, analyze it with new eyes and look at this and examine it and understand how these sort of things would play out in a congregation and how they would relate to our covenant and how they kind of operate in community. especially congregational communities. So that's what our next session is really heavily about that.
So you haven't really touched on the 5-part process yet, eh?
We did a little
You
bit.
did a little bit. Okay, good.
It's
Good.
kind of spread throughout it all. It's not necessarily like step 1, step 2, step 3. It's more like
Right.
the 5 steps as related to like your personal life, like your covenanted communities, and then like how it would shape our world is
That makes
the
sense.
structure of
because there's just so much in the book to unpack, isn't there? So this is just one tiny piece of it. I should have mentioned that at the beginning, right?
It really is a wonderful book. I feel that I think that it has genuinely changed some habits in ways that I think about forgiveness and taking care of relationships. I think that it genuinely did change my life a little bit to read it this year.
Yeah, I know. I put it into practice already because there's been so many times that I've already made mistakes and have had to come back into right relationship, like you were saying.
Right? It's really important. I really love, I am, we don't preach a gospel here.
Well, we do
But
have good news.
we're
right?
preaching the good
It
news
was,
of the importance of having right relations in your communities and with each other. That like that really, the one some of the questions that I've heard about right relations that stick with me are things about, am I assuming the best intentions of the other person, and am I willing to like put aside, my solution to figure out the best solution for the whole situation. These are a lot of it really takes a lot of putting aside your ego to maintain right relations, I think.
Yeah, and the capacity to admit that sometimes our way of thinking may be off, or we may be wrong, right? So it requires a lot of humility, I think, in order to
being able to cultivate that new way forward.
Right, and not be overconfident about our way of viewing the world, because there's more than one angle to any given situation, and there's more than one way to look at any single circumstance that might have happened.
Right?
Yeah. And I'm also wondering if there's, along those lines, I love the line that I saw outside a colleague of mine's office. It says, "Think for yourself, your minister could be wrong." But not only think for yourself, but sometimes rethink what you're thinking, because you could be wrong as well. So that's something that I wish I had incorporated into the sermon, but I didn't. But I think it's pretty appropriate to, allow ourselves the ability to change our response. Right. That's actually not a bad thing. We're not being wishy-washy when we do that, but rather we are being truthful to what is true in the relationship at the moment, and putting that first, putting the relationship above our opinions first.
Right, and putting the work, putting the community, like if there's specific things that might harm the whole community, of working to heal.
Which is so countercultural to this society that talks about individualism. And I dare say that is one of the manifestations of white supremacy culture, is to have a super focus on just one individual at the expense of the common good or the community, like you were saying. Right,
and a sense of propriety more than a sense of caring.
Right, exactly.
That like everything has to be proper. It can be a real hindrance to doing that tough work, because community and like this community healing work, it isn't always pretty.
Right.
Like I work with kids, it's really great when everything is, nicely presentable play for Christmas or something like that. But, a lot of it, building that community for these kids can be a messy space, and it's not going to be like this pretty thing, but we want it to be a space where they feel genuinely safe.
Yep, and it's messy for adults as well. And speaking of which, so we just made the announcement about your departure, and also a few other key staff as well as clergy. What do you think the way forward looks like, and how can Fourth U do things differently, perhaps.
Right? No, I think that's it was not planned to have the service called Moving Forward for the, me and you started this planning in December for this series.
Right, right.
And
we had no idea any of these major transitions were going to happen. Or at least I didn't. I can't speak for you.
No,
you might have a better crystal ball than I do, but
I did not see
did
the
not
future.
predict this.
And so like I have had a few things going on in my own personal life that caused me to need to really focus a bit more, especially on my kids and my kids' well-being, and some just dynamics going on that I had to kind of consider as I weighed this time of more change going on here at Fourth U, and that it made sense to go back to a place where the kids have a little bit more support built in with extended family, back in Michigan and in the Midwest, where my family is closer, as well as their other mom's family is closer as well. And so we wanted that opportunity to give them the space for like feeling safe. So that was really, my motivating concern was for my kids' well-being. And I have loved my work here, and I think that, whoever comes next is going to have some really great opportunity to build on the things that both DJ and then myself have built up in these years. But I think, there is challenges, and there is things that we need to examine going forward, especially around volunteering. And I think especially around, commitment to seeing it as, in New York City families, I think have a unique level of busyness. And then I think that poses challenges that maybe suburban UU congregations or like rural UU congregations don't quite have to deal with, where the UU congregation is very much a central part of their life. And I think that just dynamic is a little bit different in Manhattan especially, but for all of our New York City area congregations, that people's lives are a lot busier here. And so is the RE, is the community critical to being committed to showing up pretty regularly? I think is an important thing for especially our families, but really for everybody to think about.
Indeed. And adults too have very similar issues, I would imagine, right? And because you've been dealing with
both the kids and
religious education and faith formation. And so do you have any thoughts about that in terms of how that could look different moving forward?
Well, it's been exciting actually to have this common read as one of my, final acts to put out into the system of our community, because it's been successful, it's been well received, it's been talked about, it's created dialogue in the community.
Good.
But we did have quite a few years of kind of struggling to get attendance and to get buy-in on different adult ed things, that whether they were things that you and I tried or whether myself and our previous minister tried, that we had some challenges identifying what exactly is going to get people to commit to be there and show up for something. So I think that, community involves showing up for one another, and I think that is, I think the magnitude of changes happening at once will hopefully help this congregation to do that work of showing up for one another, so that after all this change, that there is people committed to doing this important work and to caring for one another.
Yeah. That is a great way to, I think, wrap this up, okay. Right? To think about how to move forward differently and make different choices to bring about more wholeness for this community and this congregation.
Well, thanks for asking me some questions today.
Yeah, no, I thought I'd,
surprise me.
Change the seats around a little bit, because I've been enjoying these interactive sessions actually, and I feel like it's a mutual inquisitory opportunity.
Right. They are one of my favorite moments. Well, thank you for being here, and thanks as always to our listeners.